Thank you, Kevin. Okay, I should start off by saying that this isn't my work. This is the work of my team and a bunch of other researchers. It's been driven mostly by a guy called Ben Sharp, who's part of my team. But it is very much a team effort. We can't expect one person to run a whole approach for a country. So as a brief outline of the talk, I want to talk about what the obligations are in New Zealand to manage the effects of fishing, and that's what I see as the risks. What are the risks that we face? What are the problems we face in meeting those obligations? And as a case study, if you like, the main focus of the talk is going to be about our most comprehensive ecological risk assessment at the moment. That's around seabird bycatch in commercial fisheries. Very briefly at the end, I want to talk about how we intend to expand that framework to include other risks. So these words are probably not very different than legislation in other countries. Our Fisheries Act requires us to avoid, remedy or mitigate any adverse effects of fishing, to maintain associated and dependent species above a level that ensures their long-term viability, to maintain biodiversity, to protect habitats that are important for fisheries. And we have some of the more specific requirements for protected species, by which I mean seabirds, marine mammals and protected sharks. There's also a whole suite of international obligations and agreements. And at the end, most people, I guess, are familiar with these sorts of acronyms, but I added at the end market pressure to achieve good environmental outcomes as well as fish capture. So that's the context, if you like. There's a whole lot of risks that you could think about when considering fisheries. Key ones are around stakeholder satisfaction. That includes economic, social, cultural well-being and the needs of future generations. A key one is obviously sustainability of fish stocks. But the focus mostly of my talk today is around these in green here, which are associated with the ecological effects of bycatch and other impacts of fisheries. I've listed aquaculture here, but I won't talk about aquaculture today. We have a separate risk assessment for aquaculture. And the really early one, effects on ecosystems more generally, including ecosystem services. I guess we're not even starting to address in any formal sense yet. I'll just whip through fish stock assessment in one slide. So this is a very bold summary of the performance of our fishery management regime over the last 5 years. And it basically shows the percentage of stocks that we've been able to assess and the status of those stocks. And as of 2013, late 2013, 82% of our stocks were in a state that was above what we call the soft limit. I guess you might call that your trigger in Europe. It's actually quite a low limit by some standards. It's 20% of virgin biomass. What this means though is that because most of our large productive stocks are in a good state, that something like 2/3 of all landings in New Zealand come from stocks that are in a good state and well assessed. We have similar proportions for overfishing criteria. This is biomass state. This is what fisheries management agencies have always done, and so it's not surprising that it's cost us 17 million of our $20 million annual budget to find out this on an annual basis. So that doesn't leave a huge pot of money for everything else. So if you think about my case study here, which is seabirds, New Zealand is a special place when it comes to seabirds, has more breeding populations of seabirds than any other nation on earth, and a high proportion of those are in a threatened state. So I've only plotted here, well actually I stole this plot from John Croxall, but this plot only includes species that are not in a good state by IUCN standards. So you can see that we've got something like 30 or 40 seabird populations, seabird species or stocks, you might call them, that are not in a good state. And so we need, given the very restricted budget, we need to find a way of making an assessment what the current risk is to those seabird populations. So options for doing that, and I base this very largely on the Australian ERAEF approach, hierarchical approach. One option is to do this qualitatively, and Bill showed us a pretty good example of a qualitative or merging into semi-quantitative risk assessment. Very useful because it can be done fairly quickly, it can be done relatively cheaply, and it doesn't require a whole lot of information. But it has disadvantages in that you can't add 3 low risks together, as Bill pointed out in his talk, and understand what that means. We needed something where you could draw lines in the sand and where the results were, it was possible to add the results together but also to disaggregate the results. We didn't have the money to do complex stock assessments for all of those species, so we were driven into this space here of doing the semi-quantitative approach that we think is objective and repeatable. We've made it comprehensive and we've made it additive by making it fully quantitative. It is much more data hungry than a qualitative approach, and we have to rely on proxies and assumptions. So this is our seabird risk assessment. That's just the cover of the report. And what we do is we compare what we think are the fatalities in New Zealand's EZ against population productivity, and we do that using an agreed reference point. I'll come back to that later, but I think it's a really important point. And we use it by using a spatial overlap approach, which is sort of analogous again to what Bill described. If you like, it's a quantitative implementation of the seeker method. It covers all significant New Zealand fisheries that have seabird bycatch, and it covers all 70 or so New Zealand seabird species. It doesn't include out of zone, high seas catch, which is really important for seabirds, and at this stage it doesn't include recreational molestation of seabird, which is surprisingly prevalent in New Zealand. It's a bit like doing a fish stock assessment with a target of a very high biomass. That's not a very popular analogy in New Zealand, so I don't use it very often, but the idea is to use the overlap of the birds and their vulnerability to capture, catchability, to estimate potential fatalities on an annual basis. And then just like calculating MSY, we use some combination of abundance and productivity to calculate this term called potential biological removals, which was developed in the States as a basis for a benchmarking bycatch of marine mammals. And the ratio of those two quantities gives you a risk ratio. Now we include uncertainty in all of these things. So we've got uncertainty in our estimate of catch and our estimate of essentially MSY. And so the risk ratio has uncertainty across both of those axes. Of course, in the real world, it's a lot more complicated than that, and we have to use proxies. So a key component of working out the PBR is that we need to know this quantity R max. And we found an allometric method of getting that from age at first reproduction of the seabird and the average annual survival. Now, it turns out that's a very biased approach, and we found that out only last year. So I've got some asterisks in here pointing out the changes between this iteration and the previous one of this risk assessment. But it turns out the bias can be as much as 5-fold, which is obviously not a good space to be in. So we have corrected for that bias. There's a whole bunch of stuff we need to know about the populations, how many of the populations, what's the cryptic mortality likely to be. It's not well understood. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff on fishing effort and the distribution of fishing effort. I do have maps. These are they. So we know the distribution of our fishing very well in New Zealand. It's all reported on a pretty fine scale these days. And we know the distribution of the birds tolerably well because they've been studied for a long time. We have observers who see and note down the location of captures. This example here is for white-capped albatross, with the red dots showing captures in trawl fisheries and the blue dots showing captures in surface longline fisheries for tunas. These two maps show different ways of interpreting the spatial information we have on the birds, and you can see that that can lead to quite a bit of difference. Now, what we try to do is to use the overlap between these fisheries and these birds to estimate the catchability using the observed captures. Now, we used to do that for every single species and every single fishery separately, but these days we've settled on a model that integrates all species and tries to estimate a catchability coefficient for each type of fishery and for each type of bird, and the combination of those two gives you a matrix that looks something like this. Now, I don't expect anybody to see the numbers, but I've colour-coded in accordance to the values, and you can see that some birds, like black petrel, are very much more catchable to all sorts of fisheries than other birds. Some birds are almost, like the prions, are almost not catchable at all. They don't interact with fishing gear in a way that makes them susceptible to capture. Unfortunately, the great albatrosses is one of the groups of species that are quite susceptible to captures. Now, these numbers in here is a relative capture rate, all relative to white-chinned petrel, per unit of seabird density at a particular time and per unit of fishing effort. So it's a fully quantitative way of identifying from the overlap what the likely captures of a seabird in a fishery in a year is. Now I'll skip straight to the results because it's a very short talk. These are the balloons that show our estimate of the risk ratio. That's potential captures divided by PBR, for black petrel at the top, running down to grey petrel at the bottom. The different coloured balloons show different taxonomic groups of birds. The blue ones are the small Molly-Mork albatrosses that seem to be a particular problem in New Zealand. PBR could fall anywhere within these bracketed lines here, so you can see that any of these top 5 or 6 species is potentially at pretty serious risk from commercial fisheries bycatch. And in the case of black petrels, this is on a log scale here, so that's a hugely wide confidence band for the estimate. But in terms of the likelihood of it being over the maximum possible PBR, it's not uncertain at all. So this really points us to these are the issues, these top few species. There's another 50 seabird species not even plotted on here that we can now say, that's not an issue, don't need to deal with that. This tells us where the bird issues are. And by splitting up the risk, this is coded in exactly the same way as the previous one, by the way, with the seabird species in the same order down the left and a whole bunch of different types of fisheries across the top. And this is the risk disaggregated into, for each species among the various impacting fisheries. So black petrel, serious risk, and we can see that it's associated primarily with 3 bottom longline fisheries in the north of New Zealand. Very, very strong signal that there's a seabird with a problem, and here are the relatively small fisheries that are causing the risk. Very powerful message. Similarly for the Salvin's albatross, 7 minutes. Thank you, Kevin. 7 minutes seems like a long time. Quite a lot of the signals come in from small inshore trawl fisheries. So a different bird, a different vulnerability, a different mitigation problem to try and develop. But again, some fisheries, like large fresher trawls that discard no offal, southern blue whiting trawls in the sub-Antarctic, almost no issues. We don't need to pester them. The other way we can use this risk assessment model is to prioritise future information collection. And we do that by assessing the sensitivity of the model to setting any value that goes into the model to its mean value and ignoring all the uncertainty that is otherwise propagated. And a strong signal amongst nearly all of the species is that average annual adult survival is a really important bit of information to collect. However, it's incredibly expensive and it takes years. So this is only part of the story. For black petrels, we get a signal here that it'd be really worthwhile better understanding the number of captures in those bottom longline fisheries, and also better understanding the number of breeding pairs in the population. Now, I like the Rumsfeldian reference right at the start of the conference. This includes the known unknowns only. So if the stuff that's not in our model or doesn't incorporate uncertainty that is actually out there, then you can't use this method to identify and prioritise information collection. You don't know what you don't know. Okay, in common with a lot of other countries, New Zealand's published a national plan of action to reduce seabird bycatch, and the 2013 update of that NPOA included this risk assessment and reducing risks for highly at-risk species as formal 5-year objectives. We're now 1 year into that process, and our fishery managers are starting to have a bit of a panic because it takes time to change these things. But this is a serious commitment by the New Zealand government that we are going to fix this, and the risk assessment is driving how we do that. Okay, so I did say that seabirds was the main focus. This is how we intend, or this is how we've started to expand on the seabird risk assessment. As we indicated in the NPOA, we're going to update this annually, but we're also going to generalise it to include bycatch of our seabirds worldwide and on the high seas. And we're also going to use the same method on marine mammals. We've already started that work. And on fish bycatch, focusing very much on the sharks in the first instance, because we also have a NPOA sharks that requires a risk assessment approach. The trickiest one, as I see it, is going to be benthic effects, because it's not so easy to see how we could have a line in the sand, a line in the sediment for benthic effects. It's much easier to use MSY-related reference points for fish and PBR-related ones for protected species. And we'll continue to use the risk assessments to prioritise future work and spending. Last slide. So in summary, we think the spatial overlap approach is very powerful and useful, and you can use it to estimate captures or fish catch even when your data is pretty poor. So this risk assessment approach for us is we find it incredibly useful for assessing the consequences of seabird bycatch, but it's not very good for year-to-year monitoring because you have to smooth. You need a lot of observer data to fit this well, so we have to smooth over about 5 years. It's really good for focusing attention on the real issues, for focusing on the birds at risk, the fisheries causing the risk, and driving management action. These are the plots that tell the story, really. And it's powerful for identifying information needs like observer coverage, next steps with the research, and mitigation needs. That's all I have.